Okay, welcome everybody to the National Access Cannabis Medical Cannabis Conference or Seminar. First of all, thank you to everybody for coming down and giving up your Saturday to learn more about medicinal cannabis. We appreciate that everyone took time out of their busy schedules to come down. We're hopeful that it'll be useful for you and informative. Now, these slides will be, so some of the slides you have, so just some housekeeping. So Dr. Price's slides are in your packages. Now, the other slides that throughout the conference will actually be on our website in the future, and the videos that are associated with that will also be on our website. And we will be giving, for those parties that are interested, we'll be providing logins and access to that site. So just briefly with the schedule here, so we're going to start off with the history of cannabis. There'll be a small break. Then we'll be getting into the science of cannabis. Then we'll be talking about cannabis pharmacology and drug interactions. We'll also have a vaporizer education and demonstration for you. So it'll be a hands-on. Some of the vaporizers that you have on the tables there, those are the ones that we're going to be using and demonstrating for you with our cannabinoid therapy educators. And it's a small group, as you can see. There should be more people coming as the day goes on, but I think that we'll try to personalize this, and it's an opportunity to get hands-on training that you might not get with a larger group. And we'll have a panel Q&A, and then in the late afternoon, so at around 3:30, we're going to be the bus will be arriving for the Green Relief tour, and that's going to take up the bulk of the late afternoon. So our thought there was to kind of give you a background in cannabis and then head on over to a licensed producer where instead of us just talking about cannabis and the plant, that you actually get to see how it's grown and some of the operational requirements around actually making this medicine available to patients. And so that's a summary of the day one. Day two, we're going to get into principles of cannabis dosing. We'll also have Dr. Tyler Wish, who will be talking about cannabis research and data-driven insights to help individualize cannabinoid therapy. We're going to have Dr. Paul Danick talk about medical cannabis in oncology. We'll also go a little bit more into the National Access Cannabis Medical Referral process and the educational process and some of the tools that we will be providing with healthcare practitioners that partner with us. So that's the summary. So why don't we start off with the first speaker? The first speaker is Dr. Ira Price. Doesn't need much of an introduction as he is well known throughout the cannabis industry, but he is an assistant clinical professor in Division of Emergency Medicine through McMaster. He's a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons. He's trained in emergency medicine with a fellowship in sports medicine. For the past 8 years, he's been a leader in the clinical application of natural pain solutions. He also opened one of the first clinics in Ontario that was dedicated to medicinal cannabis called Synergy Health Services. And his practice has been, he was one of the early adopters, I would say, of medicinal cannabis and giving patients a choice and allowing them to have access to this therapy. He most recently created the CARE seminar, and he has also taught other physicians and he has many roles within the cannabis industry, including as medical director and research advisor for some licensed producers. And we welcome him to the stage now, where he will be discussing the history of cannabis. Dr. Price.
All right, there's a button that I'm not allowed to touch. Oh, I thought there was another step.
The one that says no.
Don't touch that one. All right, I hate when people tell me not to do something. It never works out well. I usually do the exact opposite of that. I don't know why, but that's sort of the way I've been my whole life. I've tried changing before, but I don't think after 40 years I'll be able to do that. Just a little disclosure first, because I don't have a disclosure slide. My apologies. I do work as a medical advisor for NAC and have received and do receive honoraria for doing this. So that's important to disclose. My other disclosure includes sitting as a board member for NGC, which is a licensed producer, and for sitting as a board member and a advisor to Epic, which is an insurance company in the cannabis space. Those are currently the things that I need to disclose, and then we can sort of move forward. It is really important when we talk about cannabis to know where we've come from. Why is it that we are where we are today? Why is it that a lot of you have, or all of us, have our own connotations of what cannabis means? Where did our value system around cannabis develop? And that's why it's so important to talk about the history of cannabis. I'm not going to get in. I think Pram and everybody else will get into who NAC is, right? So I'm just going to get right into the starting of things here. So just a little bit more about me before we get started. I am an emergency physician in the Division of Emergency Medicine at McMaster. I did just leave and finish my last night shift after nearly a decade, so I'm super happy to be out of there, at least for the next couple of years. It depends who you ask. You ask them, I'm gone for a year. You ask other people, maybe gone for 2 years. And hopefully, if life works out, I'm not going back. I lost my humanity there, and it was time to regain it. So I needed a break. Eventually, I'll go back. But recently, over the last year and a half, I became a coroner in the province of Ontario, and I work in Hamilton and Brantford, sort of that whole region. I cover Hamilton and Brantford. There's a lot of things that I love to do. Here's the problem with being like ADD. You know, you just love all these different projects, so I do a whole bunch of stuff. And so, yeah, I think that's good enough. I think you got the rest of the history. So I'm going to take you back in time. We're going to go through a whole bunch of different things. But here's the first thing I want us to think about. I want us to think about confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is our belief system, are the notions and all those things that we grew up with, all the value systems, the morals, the ethics that we were taught, the media that's shown to us, our family members that have driven these things into us. That is how we see the world. That's what defines who we are. However, sometimes that bias, the way that we believe we perceive the world based on all those things, may not be the reality that we're living in. And we call that confirmation bias. So we have these blinders on. No matter what evidence is put before us, we don't always believe it. Why? Because we can't. Because we already have this notion of what is right and what is wrong. In medicine, we call that confirmation bias. And in my mind, it's one of the major prohibitors of the progression of society, because no matter what objective evidence is thrown in front of us, we're not able to see it sometimes as truth. And so, and this is a really great quote. Do you read my paper on confirmation bias? Yes, but it only proved what I already knew, right? And so it's really important when we talk about cannabis that these are some of the things we keep in mind. Keep in mind our own biases towards what we think cannabis is. So objectives. in order to understand the history, and also throughout this entire weekend when we're learning about cannabis, I want you to think about two frameworks. The first, and we're going to review those frameworks. We're going to see, whenever we talk about the history of cannabis, always try to bring it back to these two sort of frameworks. And we'll talk about them. And they're theoretical frameworks. One is a socio-economical framework, and one is a political framework. And we'll talk about how cannabis in history flows through those two frameworks. We'll talk about the invention of cannabis. We'll understand a little bit about a dated timeline about the different parts of the world and where cannabis was developed. And we'll understand the cannabis environment in our post-colonial world and where we are today. How is it that we came to this whole notion of reefer madness? Why is it that cannabis was made illegal when it was a medicine for thousands of years? And then we'll talk about redefining cannabis and reframing the conversation for today. So, first historical quote, I love it. Cannabis consumption throughout history straddles the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion, regulation and deregulation, fear and desire. So those who have, those who don't have, that which is illegal, that which is legal, and that which we want to try and that what we don't want to try. Where does that, and we all fit into the spectrum of this somewhere, right? We all have that same confirmation bias that all sort of fits around this idea. So think about those things as we go on. Cannabis has long been entwined with world economy, local social and cultural practices. That really is what defined how cannabis was perceived today. So what are these two theories? I'm not going to go into major detail on the theories, but I want you to think about them when we talk about cannabis in general and when we talk about the history of cannabis. The first one is a world systems theory, and that's how do drugs flow through borders and how are they governed? We're currently, I mean, you just have to read the newspaper. I don't know if I travel to the U.S., it's funny. I'm like, I'm going to leave my cell phone at home because I read all this stuff and they're going to start going through my phone. And I'm like, shit, if they know how to use Google, I'm screwed. So for me, it doesn't really matter. But if you think about how cannabis makes it across borders, how do we import and how do we export cannabis, and how do we get it to where we need, to the end user, and to our patients. So that's a world systems theory. But then we also have this economical and political theory, and that's how do they affect the populations? What are their effects on the population when somebody's actually using cannabis? So I want you to think about those two theories as we talk about the history of cannabis. So I call it the invention of cannabis. Clearly, it wasn't the invention of cannabis. It's like a play on terms. Hopefully you guys get that. I don't know. Sometimes doctors don't always get it, and they're like, well, it's not the invention. All right. Anyways, reminded me of the movie, The Invention of Lying. Did anybody see that movie? By the way, it was awesome, right? Anyway, I won't tell you that. That'll just offend half the other room, so I'll leave it out. Okay, so what are names for cannabis in different parts of the world? So if we look at China, one of the names is Ma. And these are also, you're going to hear these terms, they've been used previously and they're still being used to some degree today. Keef or hashish, that's what it's called in the Middle East. We sometimes think of hash, and it is, when you think of hashish, if you actually take like a flower, the actual bud of the cannabis, and you sift out the crystals of it. You get the crystals that are at the bottom. The trichome or that keef, for example. If you actually just heat that up with any form of heat, it turns into this black material and it becomes a little sticky. That's really what hashish is. It's just heated up crystals from the actual plant itself. So then we go to India and we have ganja, of course. In Sanskrit, it's called kanap. Kanab in modern day Iran, or in Farsi, it's Persian. It's a Farsi term from ancient Persia. And then we get to the name that we sort of call it today, which is cannabis, and that's a Greek term that comes from the word canvas, or translates to canvas. So what are the origins of cannabis? How many plants are there? What does a sativa mean? What does it mean when I say cannabis sativa and cannabis indica? People, all the time I hear, I like to use this sativa because, it keeps me awake. And don't forget to hashtag me if you're taking photos. I'm kidding. Anyway, Jam, you guys, it's early in the morning, huh? There we go. Hey, I feel like we should do some jumping jacks first. Some people have already been to the gym or had a late night. Pram doesn't smile. All right. All right. So, I often hear that, I need a sativa because the sativa keeps me awake. Who's heard that before? Or I need this indica because, this indica, it sits me, I sit on the couch and I just veg out. And I need that pain relief and the sleep that comes along with an indica. How many people have heard these terms before? Right, sativa and indica. Well, I call that bro science. Bro. This is what it's good for. That's what we're trying to demystify. When we talk about sativa and we talk about indica, we're literally just talking about regions of the world. That's what we're talking about. There are actually two types of cannabis sativa. There's first of all, a sativa means an equatorial region of the world. So somewhere in a subtropic part of the world. That's what sativa means. That's it. It doesn't mean what's in the cannabis. It doesn't mean that it's going to make you stay awake. I can show you two strains, one that's a sativa and one that's an indica, and they both look identical. And one's supposed to make you stay awake, and they'll do the opposite, right? So when we talk about what a sativa does and what an indica does, we want to move away from those terms, and we just want to talk about and sound educated about it, we're really just talking about equatorial regions. So when we talk about sativa, there's really two types of sativa. One is cannabis sativa, and that's the one the original one that was founded, and that one actually contains higher amounts of THC. It's in an equatorial region of the world, so subtropic rainforests, that's what you got to think of. So if I think of a plant in a rainforest, this is how you're going to be able to identify what a sativa plant looks like. If I think about an equatorial, we're becoming botanists too. If I think about an equatorial region in plants, what do they look like? What do trees look like when you're in a rainforest? They're these tall, long trees, right? They have to fight for sunlight. It's really warm, but you're fighting for sunlight because you have this whole lane. It's a really lush green environment. So when you think of a sativa plant, you think of these tall, long trees with big, long branches with arms that stick out. Why? Because the rain will drop off from the top of the plant. This is how they were born. And then it'll be able to water the entire plant while fighting for that sunlight. So you see these long, beautiful, long leaves. That's what a sativa looks like. Now, and it's born in an equatorial region. Then there's cannabis sativa L. That's a little different. L stands for Linus. That's the guy that founded it in the late 1700s. In the meantime, that's what hemp is. Hemp doesn't contain high amounts of THC. We're not necessarily talking about industrial hemp. We're talking about hemp in general. And so hemp contains very low amounts of THC. And that's one of the cannabinoids. There's hundreds of cannabinoids. But in particular, when we talk about sativa, we talk about cannabis sativa, and then we talk about cannabis sativa L. Otherwise, the L stands for Linus, as I said, but the otherwise known as hemp. And it doesn't contain the psychoactive ingredient THC, to a very low extent. But then we have the other one. So that's cannabis sativa, equatorial regions near the equator. And then we have cannabis indica. When I talk about indica, we're literally talking about locations on our planet, not the contents of what's in the plant. But I will give you an example in a moment why you can sort of see some differences between indicas and sativas in their original environments. Now we like subspecies and we crossbreed and genetically modify, so there's no real difference per se. But in their original states, there is, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. So cannabis indica, it comes from a less equatorial location, further away from the equator, usually around, initially invented or found in the Hindu Kush region of the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. And what does that mean? It's in a really harsh environment on tall hill, right, big mountains, which is pretty barren, and gets a lot of wind, right? So when you think about a cold environment and you think about lots of wind and you think I have to protect myself, you're going to get small. You're going to get into a ball. So when you think about the cannabis indica plant, you're going to look at a smaller plant, shorter bunchier leaves to protect itself. That's what a cannabis indica looks like. Less sunlight exposure as well, cloudy region. Okay, so now, why do people say, well, this sativa keeps me awake and this indica puts me to sleep? Let's look at the contents of each one. What happens to THC when it's exposed to sunlight? Bueller. No? Anyway, that's an old movie too. Okay, so what happens to THC in sunlight is it degrades. You lose THC the longer you're exposed to sunlight, the longer you're exposed to heat. So what happens is you have these lower amounts of THC in sativas, at least in its original state. You don't find that anymore. You also have lower amounts of myrcene. People think this terpene puts you to sleep. I'm not so sure anymore, but initially that's what people used to think. And now what we're doing is we're crossbreeding all of these things, so it doesn't really matter anymore. Does that make sense? We also have this third type. I don't remember which one. Oh, don't press that. Okay, that works. We also have this third type, and the third type is Cannabis ruderalis. Now, this one looks a little bit different. A lot of the plants that we see today actually coming from like homegrown seeds, if people are doing their own growing themselves, and even sometimes in hybrids, you'll often see this ruderalis. It has lower amounts of THC, but it's not one that we usually use all that often, and it grows wild. Okay, so timelines, pre-modern timeline. Let's talk about China. So the question is, was it invented in China or was it invented in India, where they first started talking about cannabis? And it all depends who you ask. If you're in China, it's in China. If you're in India, it's definitely in India. I had this guy on my podcast once. Goes by the name of Yogi Bubba. He was a Bollywood producer, and he produced the movie Bollywood, actually, in like the mid-'90s. I don't know if you remember this movie. Anyway, his name's Yogi Bubba, or Blondie Khan, they call him as well. Anyways, so he told me, and this is a conversation we had when talking about, I was like, well, first it was found on these Yangshu tombs on pottery. We're going back 6,000 years, maybe somewhere between even longer than that from where we are right now. And he said, well, that's only because one of Shiva's heads was cut off and it rolled into China, and that's where cannabis came from. So it depends who you ask. Where cannabis was first found. So I don't think the timeline isn't a linear timeline per se. So this is just sort of it may have been here at the same time that it was over here. And when we talk about Europe, we used to think, hey, the Middle East, it must have been there forever. Maybe it was, but the Eastern world, like, if we're talking about India, it's been around a lot longer than it was, for example, in the Middle East area. So what happened in China? So they find it painted on the pottery, somewhere around, let's say, 67 to 8,000 years ago. But then there's this awesome guy. His name is Dr. Ethan Russo. Anybody heard of Dr. Ethan Russo before? Yeah, really cool guy. He's a neurologist. He became an archaeologist. God, I can't remember how long ago. But anyways, most of what his work now is archaeology. We actually learned a lot about how we store cannabis from him. Because in probably it was 2009, I'd like to say, he was on a dig and he unveiled a tomb of a 3,000-year-old shaman and found 1 pound of manicured cannabis that was still usable 3,000 years later. Right? So the environment that it was found in, that's where we learned how to store cannabis. I'm kind of afraid of falling off, and I never stand still very well. So this is, a thing. If I fall off, somebody come help me. There's pharmacists here, right? Okay, everyone trusts the pharmacist. By the way, just an aside here, you guys are the most trusted healthcare professionals. I guess you all know that. No, but anyway, that's a true story. Okay. It's not funny. That's why you're not laughing. I give up. All right, so let's go to India. Initially, actually, let me talk to you quickly about China. Initially, China, it wasn't used as a medicine. It was mostly for traditional or ceremonial purposes. It eventually lost favor around the 6th century, and that's because there was a movement at the time for rational thought. And the idea of becoming becoming intoxicated in any way was looked down upon. So China sort of lost their momentum around the 6th century. But really during that time, and even before that, if we go into India, India is really where cannabis started for the purposes we use it, for a medical purpose. And that's with the advent of the ganja doctor. We usually think of ganja doctors, when we hear about it, we think about what's happening, we think about Jamaica. It must be an African idea, but it was an Indian idea. That's where it started in India. It started with the ganja doctor. And it was kind of interesting, even today, when we talk about Shivaratri Day, if you are in India, you've got to bring a cannabis leaf to visit Shiva, and this still happens until this day. So it's been used for thousands and thousands of years, and it's built into the culture. So what happened in the Middle East? It wasn't always there. I mean, we hear about it in, was it in the biblical times? Did Jesus have it and all this other stuff? Maybe, maybe not. What we do have documented is that there was this, a nation of Scythians, and they were a nomadic tribe. And the nomadic tribe happened to bring it into the Middle East, probably around 3000 BC, and it's had a really nice long life up into the 1400 BC. But then Europe is where it all changed into the pre-modern time. So what happens? So you have these, during Slavic wars, eventually it's brought over to Europe, and then eventually into Britain, all the way up into the 5th century. Britain is where cannabis changed altogether. But up until that time, cannabis hadn't really gotten outside of that sort of region. It never really expanded to the whole world as a medical perspective. So what happened? Why did cannabis become so important in the world, and how did it get out there? Well, to understand that, we have to understand colonial Britain and what happened to cannabis. What comes along with colonialism and capitalism? What happens? Anybody? Greed. But you also have cheap shipping. So along with ships and transportation, you have decreased costs of a whole bunch of different things. So not only are you able to ship your goods, but along with the usual goods, all these exotic plants started getting shipped around the world. So you eventually have this world trade now, or at least this global trade opens up. And so cannabis is one of those plants that starts making its way around the world. But that wasn't until the colonial British Empire started taking over. Cannabis was actually really important in the world. Mostly hemp was really important in the world up till that time. Russia, we still talk about Russia. Russia at the time owned the hemp trade, the global market on hemp. And the number one commodity in the world was hemp. Why? Because that's how we made things. Everything we had was pretty much made from hemp. Our clothing, our paper, our we didn't have oil. We had rope. A lot of boats are still made from hemp. Even a lot of our medications at that time, the traditional medicines, came from hemp and came from cannabis. In Canada, or I should say Canada, in Britain, which also included colonial Britain, until the late 1600s, if you owned more than 60 acres of land, it was mandatory for you to grow hemp on your land. That was Queen Elizabeth. We had to do that. So the question is, what's happened? Where did it all go wrong? Where did we start losing this momentum of cannabis, and where did hemp and all this stuff start becoming illegal? Actually, if we go back to colonial Britain, the first person that actually started doing clinical trials on this was O'Shaughnessy. And if you look at O'Shaughnessy's Pharmacopoeia, that's where cannabis is first listed, all the way up until the late 1800s, where cannabis was used for multiple reasons. One of the patents on any product, there was over 40 patents that included cannabis extracts from them. Both the AMA, which existed in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, even up to the OMA in the mid 1900s, our medical societies were all proponents of cannabis. And when it started to become illegal, the AMA, the American Medical Association, opposed the move. So the question is, what happened? Why did we become so against cannabis in our countries? So I like to use this. So where did prohibition start from? James Mills. So cannabis prohibition grew out of politics of empire rather than science or rational assessment. Britain, I already told you, they had an understanding that they knew that if you wanted to be an economical power back then, you needed hemp. That's what kept Russia safe. So they wanted to keep cannabis safe, but they also were under a lot of pressure. Now we're going back to the early 1900s, and I'll start with Britain first just because, we're already talking about them. So cannabis was around for thousands of years. It was used forever, but it wasn't until like the early 1900s that we started to lose favor in it. And it was Britain, it wasn't actually initially. They got pressured from the UN from the United States to actually outlaw it. And it was used, as I mentioned, they're trying to keep it safe, but eventually they ban it in the Cocoa Leaves and Indian Hemp Regulation Act of 1925. It actually became a Schedule III drug, which has no medical benefit whatsoever. And it stayed that way until 2 years ago, and so what happened? So why was it that the United States and Canada, by the way, we have a pretty dark history here ourselves. The good news is we apologized for it pretty much. If you want to read a really good article, my suggestion is you go back to Diane Riley for the Honorable Pierre Nolan. I pulled that out, in 1998. And you can Google that. Because it's on the Parliament of Canada's website, where they talk about what happened in Canada and how cannabis became illegal. So what happened in the United States? We'll start with the US and we'll go over to Canada. In the 1920s, it's sort of where it all started to go wrong. It was actually the early 1900s over into the 1920s. It was really a perfect storm of both racism and greed. And now I hope I don't offend too many people in here, but I'm going to tell the truth. And if it offends you, I'm sorry, but sometimes it's kind of hard to hear the truth. So what is it? What was this perfect storm? What happened? Where was the racism? What is this intolerance? It was really both. Let's start with racism and intolerance first. So in the early 1900s, you have the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution starts bringing people into the United States, right? In parts that the U.S. basically took from Mexico in the Mexican U.S. war. So and never gave back. Places like San Francisco. And so what happened during that time? You have this massive anti-Mexican sentiment. So the Mexican population comes into the United States and they're actually being productive. They're working, creating jobs, and you have this rich elite that doesn't want that kind of thing to happen. So there's a massive anti-American migration policy that starts to come into place. But then you also have this. You have these different revolutions that are starting to happen within the American population themselves. You have things like the jazz movement that's happening and the blues movement. And then you have Bohemia in New York. These things are starting to take shape. You have it was still a pretty large class system, so you have this lower class system of people that are actually starting to form. But what do you do if you want people to not have a voice? You start putting them in jail, and you start putting together policies that make it so that they can't have a voice, right? So you have this massive and this is the racism part, you have this massive anti-Mexican stance, and you have this large anti-lower class at that time, anti-lower class movement, and you have to think of a way that you're going to demonize them. There's a really good way, and that was Hearst and his guys. They did a great job with that yellow journalism kind of thing that was happening in all of his newspapers. And that's one of the ways that they did it. They talk about, I didn't tell you how they did it yet, because first I'm going to talk about the greed part of it, where it became this perfect storm, why cannabis got sort of caught up in this whole thing. But I love this quote: "Early prejudice against cannabis was thinly veiled racist fears of its smokers," right? So that's a really, really good a really good quote. So far I've only told you about the racist part of it, right? I haven't told you about other parts of it. But then we have this greed. How do I go back? Oh, okay. So then we have greed. What happens in the early 1900s? You know, hemp can be produced for, hemp fuel can be produced for 15 cents a liter forever with no carbon footprint, right? Simple to produce. Fields and fields and fields and fields and layers of hemp can be produced simply, cheap, non-expensive, and can be used as fuel. It's really easy. But what happens in the 1900s, early 1900s? You've got guys like Rockefeller running the United States, and they've got sun oil, imperial oil. You've got synthetics that are starting to come around. You've got big pharma that's starting to label drugs. And if you have medication that's already being used and simply being produced, you have to think of a way to demonize that, its competitor. What was the biggest competitor for fabrics and synthetics and pharma coming around and oil? The biggest competitor was hemp, hands down. That's basically what happened. So you have this greed thing happening, and you have these thinly veiled racist fears of the Mexicans coming into the United States, and of the lower class that may try to, mount into something. So what happens? You've got to demonize them. And that's where you have guys like Hearst and Aslinger, who was the first deputy chief of the Bureau of Narcotics. You have these guys that come around and they start to demonize the population. And that's what leads to reefer madness. You have one guy that literally on his own was able to demonize both cannabis and the entire Mexican population moving into cannabis. You know the reason why I don't use the word marijuana anymore? Marijuana, the term, comes from a racist connotation based on Aslinger, who said, that represents a lazy, knife-wielding Mexican. That's where the term comes from. It was a Spanish term that was used to depict a not productive, lazy Mexican. That's where the word marijuana comes from. That's why I don't use that term, because that's where it came from. Initially, it's interesting, if you look at even the language our government uses today, all of a sudden today, now, thankfully, after a decade of us trying, they use the word cannabis, the cannabis law, right? The new act, Cannabis Act, is coming into fruition. Even the ACMPR, even up to 2 years ago, had the word marijuana in it. Even before that. So, the world has changed even within progression. Even, I always say that one day is 1 month is 1 year in the cannabis world, right? But the progression of it is recognizing where we came from. Thankfully, Canada sort of has recognized this, where a lot of other countries have not recognized that yet, but they're moving towards using the word cannabis, which more closely represents what may be inside or is inside the plant itself. But I don't use the word like marijuana. But he did a great job of coining it, because how many people heard the word marijuana here before? You can raise your hand. We all heard it. Right. So that's our confirmation bias, because that's all we knew. So we're taking those blinders off a little bit. And then it all leads to what? It all leads to reefer madness. Reefer madness happens in the early 1920s. It's a movie depicting a dark-skinned devil raping your white children. That's literally what the movie is. I'm not making this up. You can go and watch it. And he's smoking a joint. That's literally what it shows. I don't need to make this stuff up. You can go watch it. I'm literally just showing you what's out there. That's where our belief system comes from. That's what we know about cannabis. We don't know about cannabis anything other than 1900 to 1930. That's all we know. So what happened in Canada? Canada doesn't do a much better job. Actually, we were kind of worse than the United States. We led this drive. We've got a guy named William Lyon Mackenzie King, who's deputy prime minister, and he's sent out to British Columbia to squash the opium race riots. You have a group of people rioting against the Asian population. He's sent out there to stop that. You would assume somebody who's stopping a riot goes out and tells the rioters, stop. Don't cause harm, right? But instead of doing that, He looks at the other side in the Asian population and says, well, guys, you have these herbal medical schools, you've got opium dens. By the way, that's where most of our pharmaceuticals come from. So we're going to close all those things down. We're going to close the pro-herbal medical schools. We're going to close down your opium dens, and we're going to outlaw you from becoming pharmacists in our country till 1946. So if you were Asian in Canada, until 1946, you couldn't be a pharmacist. That's a long, dark history that we have here. And so that all comes together in our prohibition. But that's all we knew about cannabis. Somehow, they decided to throw in cannabis into the opium race riot. Some of cannabis, well, it's pro-herbal, it's herbal, Asian, well, let's just throw it all together. That's literally basically what happened. And if you don't trust me, just look it up on the government's website. Literally, the Parliament of Canada talks about it. That's where a lot of this information comes from. But we were lucky. The 60s came around of reason and science. But you also had a lower class that wasn't shutting up. They start coming together and now have political interests versus just being a marginalized people. It's the era of reason, it's the evidence and evidence. In the 1960s, you've got these two guys in Israel. It's an interesting story. You can watch them talk about it on YouTube. A guy by the name of Dr. Meshulam and Dr. Gaoni. We may have heard of these guys. They're like the leading researchers when it comes to cannabis. These two guys in Israel actually identify for the first time what THC is. Of course, back in the 60s, they didn't have rigorous, review ethics boards like we do now. So they extracted this cannabinoid. They didn't know what it was at the time, and they fed it to a dinner party. And so you can hear them talking about it on YouTube. It's kind of funny. Everybody started laughing. So that's really how THC was initially identified. But then you also, from the 60s to the 70s, even and into the 80s, into today, we have places like Spain, Italy, Portugal, Switzerland, Netherlands. All these places move towards legalization or decriminalization. Canada, which is like one of the first unified countries to actually not just decriminalize it, but legalize it, which was based on a lot of research conducted over the last century. We're moving towards that now. The United States has, certain states, for example, have legalized it, but still as a country, federally, it's still considered illegal. Funny enough, 41 of the states in the U.S. have pretty much legalized it. It's kind of crazy that it's still federally illegal. But and that's going to change too. The FDA has approved Epidiolex. You have a whole bunch of things. Britain downgrades. Well, I'll tell you. You know the story of you've watched the news recently, right? Where you have this kid from Britain who came to Canada in order to be treated. It was all over the news. In order to be treated for intractable seizures, because nobody in Britain, he's actually Irish, I think he was Irish, and but nobody, or maybe Scotland, because Scotland and Britain, they're the close ones, right? So nobody there would treat him. He was actually treated at my clinic, and they went back. On their way back, the Border Patrol took away their cannabis. But then in the last month, the entire government has flipped 360. They've now legalized it for medical purposes based on this one kid. So the world has significantly changed. I'll tell you why in a second. So we're dealing still with the 60s, the age of reason and enlightenment. So we sort of start having research being produced. I told you we find out that THC exists, right? But then we find out, and it wasn't until the 80s that we start finding out that our body contains pretty much the exact same stuff that's in the plant. It's not okay to say cannabis, but it's okay to say anandamide, right? Do you know what anandamide translates to? Ananda in Sanskrit means bliss. So we have a bliss molecule within our own body, anandamide. It's our own cannabinoid. We have this stuff in our body. So we start realizing we have a CB1 receptor, CB2 receptors. We'll talk about all this when we talk about the science of cannabis. So we realize not only does this stuff exist there, but we now are in the age of reason and science. We have to follow the evidence. That is our goal. That's our duty. We realize that our body contains the same stuff. And then finally, it's interesting. In 2007, the United Nations tells us that 1 in every 43 people on our planet smoke cannabis for its psychoactive effects. But here's redefining the need. This is why we need to talk about it today. This is how it's relevant to us in Ontario. The largest relative per capita, we're in the middle of the worst crisis we've ever seen when it comes to death related to a substance, and that's the opioid crisis. You know, I'm a coroner, and I would say in my last 2 weeks, 1 in every 3 patients I see is dying, or every decedent, they're not patients anymore. Every person who dies, 1 in 3 of them, it's related to an opioid. It's nuts what's happening out there, and it's only getting worse. You know, I had this one patient the other day, and I hate, picking on family doc. We're all doctors. So where's my doc? Oh, over there. This guy, he's given 250 Percocets every month, 187 Dilaudid every month, because he was complaining of chronic pain. No investigations done on this guy. In the meantime, in his autopsy, I sent him for post-mortem because it doesn't seem to make any sense. He's riddled with cancer head to toe. 14-centimeter mass in his lung, but nobody found it because it's easier to throw drugs at people. We're trying to deal with pain, and we have a toolbox that's tiny. I describe it as you're trying to build a house, and you have a toolbox. In your toolbox, you have 1 nail and a screwdriver. And you're trying to take the back end of a screwdriver and drive that nail into the wall. Eventually, it'll get in there. We've all done it before when we try to hang these pictures. But you're going to ruin the wall on the way. And that's where we are now. Canada has the largest problem in the world of opioid abuse. And Ontario has the largest problem of opioid abuse in Canada. My city of Hamilton has the largest problem in Ontario. So, I think altogether we're not doing so well when it comes to the world abuse of opioids. We have an average death rate of 7 to 100,000 people die because of an opioid. Hamilton, we're up to about 13 out of 100,000 people. You could get all this stuff. They have now opioid databases that you can just go online. Health Canada will show you all this stuff. Excuse me. It is so important that at this time in our world, from any other time, we need to turn to an alternative or alternatives. Cannabis isn't the answer for everybody. I'm not here to say, yes, I'm a proponent of cannabis, but I got into cannabis because I was frustrated. I was tired of seeing patients showing up to the emergency department dying every single day. I work as base hospital in the emerge, so I answer the phone for paramedics around our region. One night I had 4 deaths related to an opioid. It's not normal. There is an alternative out there. Yes, do we need more research, more evidence? Of course we do, but do we know the lack of harm? We sure know the lack of harm when it comes to cannabis, so it's time to look for those benefits, and that's sort of where we're going today. 1 in 9 prescriptions that we write today are used as off-label anyways. I would probably, and you guys may know better than me, it's probably more than 1 in 9. At least these are the stats that we have. So these are things that we need to think about when we talk about where we were with cannabis, where we are now, and where we're going to the future. So let's think about our bias. I'll tell you, I know it sounds like it's really dark. It's actually, this is an amazing time. There's a paradigm shift happening in the world where when we treat patients, we're no longer just telling people, take this. That archaic patriarchy is technically dying. It's like it's dying. Patients want to be in charge of their medicine, and we need to help facilitate that. And cannabis is one of those things that we're going to learn about as potentially an option for them to decrease or increase the size of our toolbox. It's been around for thousands of years. It wasn't until the 1800s when we started doing some clinical trials on it, thanks to O'Shaughnessy, a pharmacist and a physician. And then eventually in the 1900s, it starts losing. And it was only 100 years. If you look at our entire civilization, it was 100 years that cannabis had a decline. And that's how we see the world. We see it through the last 100 years. And now it's time to redefine that and realize that our bodies produce the same stuff that's in the plant, nearly, and now we can be using it as a medicine. That's sort of my, that's it. I think that's all I have to say when it comes to the history of cannabis. All right. I'll take some questions. Fire away. Literally. You just have to look at a couple of the experiences. The Netherlands experience, Wales experience, Spain's experience. Anywhere cannabis laws are more lax, crime has decreased significantly. The use of hardline drugs has gone down significantly. We're talking from 6% down to 2%.
What about the Colorado? Sorry.
Crime is like disappeared in Colorado.
But there's also a burden on the social system in which many people are on welfare, more people there are...
The amount of money that's being earned from the legalization of cannabis in Colorado is paying for most of Colorado right now. I think it was like in the way of $2 billion. All right, guys, thanks so much.
Okay, we're going to have a short break, and I just realized that I don't think half the people in this room know who I am, and I don't even think I introduced myself. So my name is Pram Sandhu, and I'm the VP of Medical Operations for National Access Cannabis. And we have a short break, and we'll reconvene in about 15 minutes or so. So help yourselves to some more coffee and some goodies in the back there.